Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Eric Davis, continuing our explorations of the cultures of consciousness. Satanism, taste the word. To most it will conjure feelings of anxiety, while others may feel it as a ridiculous and immature pseudo-religion. Few people are likely to have a positive reaction. These are the opening words to the introduction of a new book called The Devil's Party, Satanism in Modernity. And it's today we'll be speaking with one of its editors, Jesper Petersen. And I love those that announcement because it's strange how much power that term still has, even though we're in this secular age. Every transgression has been achieved. We're jaded by the extremities of human culture, and yet there's still a sort of strange power, even after decades of cheesy and sometimes excellent heavy metal records, that the concept of Satanism has, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. I mean, obviously, part of the whole appeal and thrill of the position as a sort of ideological or cultural or even religious perspective has to do with the fact that it still has this charge. I think, probably speaking for a lot of people, at least in my generation, that the first time they came across the works of the notorious Anton LaVey, my fellow Californian Lord of Darkness, that there was this kind of creepy feeling like, wow, how can I even have my hands on this book? I mean, this is extreme stuff. This is like dynamite. It's like, you know, who knew that a book could feel so powerful? You know, and as we'll see, the story is much richer, in some ways more ordinary, and in some ways even more interesting than the surface seems. And it's always important, especially when talking about Satanism, to draw a distinction between the ways that people on the outside talk about Satanism, fear Satanists, have ideas about what Satanists do and what they want, and the ways that Satanists describe themselves. And that's going to be an important distinction to keep in mind. I was lucky enough as a San Francisco resident to drive by to see the Black House that Anton LaVey owned out in the Richmond district before they tore it down. This was after it was vacated, but before it was torn down. And you know, one of the funny things about it was just that the street itself is very very normal. San Francisco, despite all of the sort of sense of magic and weirdness and countercultural pizzazz, has a lot of fairly sedate neighborhoods that are really more like suburbs, even though they're still in the city. And the outer Richmond, or the Richmond where Anton LaVey lived, was one of these areas. And so part of the charm of it was going by was not just seeing the house and imagining all the doings there, but also seeing it in context. And indeed, as with so many religious and cultural topics, it's always more interesting when you look at things in context, and I'm sure that our guest today is going to help us do that. But before we bring on Professor Petersen, we'll welcome on, of course, our co-host here on Expanding Mind, Maja Dow. Hi, Maja.
Hi, Eric.
So when you were growing up, you know, I know you and I both shared a sort of loose and groovy West Coast kind of upbringing. And did you know anyone who was sort of in your peer group or your age group who considered themselves a Satanist?
I mean, I think they wouldn't maybe say Satanist formally, but absolutely, like in a more I knew a lot of casual Satanists. How about that? And it was more affiliated with like metal music. You know, most of my peeps that were interested in that just really liked, you know, Slayer or the heavy metal scene, and they got kind of into it that way. Myself included. You know, I was a teen witch, so I was reading all this stuff, and of course, if you're interested in paganism at all, the first thing you're going to run across is all the satanic literature. And so I just kind of mulled all through that through my teens, and then we kind of talk about some of these concepts with all my heavy metal peeps. And then I had like my first satanic breakthrough when I read the Theosophy material about Lucifer and Luciferianism, and that was like my first kind of divergent perspective on who this Satan was and what was happening there. So then from there I went, like all over the place. But it originally started from hanging out in the woods with a bunch of metalheads.
Yeah, it's funny. I had one semester. I was, deep into the same kind of weirdness you were at the time. I had one semester in high school. I think I was 15, and it was a sort of comparative literature class. And so reading books from that were originally written in different languages, not just English language. And somehow I managed to. I started off with existentialism, and then every other book that I read for the whole semester had Satan in it as a character. And I read Last Temptation of Christ, The Master and Margarita, and I became completely obsessed and fascinated with this figure.
You know what I would do?
The idea of Satanism still whatever else we can talk about has a initiatory quality for at least certain kinds of young people, and then later on older people.
I remember very specifically I would order books through interlibrary loan on Satanism because they would arrive at my house in an envelope and package. So I was like the sneaky Satanist, where I would get a hold of these books and material in this covert mechanism called the interlibrary loan envelope. So that's that one.
I love that story. Great. Well, with that, let's bring on our guest. Jesper, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Erik. I'm fine.
Good. Am I pronouncing your first name correctly?
Yeah. Jesper is good.
Very good. So I just want to place you. You're at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, teaching religious education. What's religious education as opposed to religious studies? Is it a different idea?
I think that's just a bad translation. I have a degree in religious studies and the history of religions, but when I finished my PhD, I had to find work, and the only place I could find work was teaching how to teach religion in Norwegian schools.
All right, but you're Danish originally.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm teaching. It's a secular subject in Norwegian schools and in Danish schools as well. So I teach how to teach religion in schools at the moment.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Well, that's an interesting setup for our discussion, because one of the points you make at the beginning of in the introduction that I was just reading before. Is that because Satanism is such an emotion-stirring topic, people have so many reactions to it right away, and you make the point right off the bat that one of the ways to look at it is to look at it with the sober, objective eye of the scholar, is to say, look, whatever else this is, it's something people do, and we can look at it critically, historically, and for me, it makes the writing, that sounds like it might be dry. It sounds like, they're going to take all the fun and the craziness out of it. But I actually found that in this book and then the previous book that you edited, Contemporary Religious Satanism, as well as your articles, it's actually the opposite. That somehow having the cool head of the scholar enables you to go even farther into very, very interesting, rich, dynamic materials. Almost like it's almost like you get a pass. You get to get closer to things. So I'd really love to hear how you got into looking at this material and realize that it could be such a rich place to bring your religious studies scholarship to bear.
Yeah, I have an origin story just like you two. I bought the Satanic Bible when I was 16 or 17 as well, and I was it looked very different from all the rest of the occult and spiritual literature I had in my boys' room. So I was actually afraid of putting it up on the shelf because it looked so evil, and I thought it actually had that pulsing quality to it because of the black and the colors on the front, the red and the pink. So I thought that I better put it in a drawer unless it somehow is contagious to all the other literature and makes it more evil or something. But that was when I was young. Then I got into religious studies, and I was actually writing a master's thesis on religion and science on Fridtjof Capra. And as with many people who work with the master's thesis, you get bored with the subject and you start exploring other things on the side. And my supervisor at the time, he had contact with some Danish Satanists and some letters that had gone between them and a radical Christian group. And that was very interesting, so I just spent some time working on that. And from that, it developed this project on studying Satanism as a religion as opposed to the imaginings of people who were not Satanists but charge other people with being Satanists. And I discovered that, as you say, that it's just like with literature studies. You can read a novel or a book or a short story, and you can get a lot out of it just on an emotional level. But as soon as you turn critical, there is a tendency for things, if you have that mindset, to be even richer. Criticism is not bad. It's not destroying anything. It's making the experience even better because you have the skills and the tools to actually take something apart and see some value outside of the existential or emotional value. And that's exactly what happened with Satanism as well. I mean, one thing is just experiencing it on a personal level, but studying it as a scholar, and I'm not a Satanist myself, but studying it as a scholar, I think, opened up a whole connection and a whole world of currents, as the occult subculture call it themselves. A lot of currents who are influencing each other and reading off each other and doing some interesting stuff.
Well, so let me ask you this, just as a distinction, because what you're saying is, I think, totally true. Like, why not examine and criticize? It's going to open it up. So why do you think this particular subject is they discourage even criticizing it or opening it up, and you're not even, like, allowed to look at it? So, like, not only, like, I mean, some of the churches and Christians over the years obviously have said, like, you know, well, here's what's going to happen if you look at this stuff. So there's a lot of, like, threats. So how would you kind of compare that ability to go into it and get free? And in this particular subject matter, do you think there's like a single reason for that, or is it just really complicated, why people don't want to open it up?
That's a good question, and I think you get sort of blind as a historian of religion or a religious studies scholar, because you work with anthropological methods and you work with bracketing your own values and your own emotional reaction and just studying religions from as best you can and a detached point of view to understand what's going on. And of course you talk to them and you engage with them, but you also have to have that outside position in order to understand it. And when you've been doing that for 5, 10 or 15 years, you get blind to the fact that regular people haven't got that skill. I mean, that's something you train and work on. And I understand completely why people react to the subject of Satanism, because, as Erik said in the beginning, it has a lot of baggage. It has a lot of connotations that are not belonging in good society and in good company. So I understand completely why people react, but that is exactly why it should be studied. This is a pretty small subculture when you're talking about members and numbers, but both the emotional and the intellectual effect on society is huge. Both in terms of popular culture and in terms of reactions, if you look at the Satanic Panic, for example, of the 80s. So this is a subculture with a lot of effects outside its numbers, so it needs to be studied.
Well, I feel like one of the biggest distinctions that I learned from your work or from reading contemporary religious Satanism and so the articles are on other people as well, is this very important distinction. Let's leave aside the way that the world outside has conceived Satanists for the moment, and talk about the way that Satanists have described themselves, imagined themselves, constructed their own stories. And there's a very, very important distinction that you can almost even tell the story through talking about Anton LaVey, and particularly the emergence of the Temple of Set and Michael Aquino from Anton LaVey. But there's this very important distinction between two very different kinds of Satanism, which from the outside can look almost identical. Or straight up identical, but they're very different internally. On the one side, you have what we could call the rationalist or maybe libertarian kind of Satanism, and on the other side, you have what people call the esoteric or the more explicitly religious kind of Satanism. And I'd love to have you sort of make that distinction, because it was once I learned that, it made things a lot clearer in my own understanding.
Yeah, that was exactly, I instead of undertaking, as I originally wanted, undertaking some sort of case study, ethnographic fieldwork into the satanic milieu, as I call it, I chose actually with my supervisor when I got to write my PhD to actually do that kind of theoretical and framework establishing work instead. So that's what my dissertation is about, just trying to analyze how these different types of Satanism are being constructed by the Satanists themselves, and what it actually means for them and does for Satanism in order to develop it as a legitimate religious option in a sense. And of course, what is interesting about Satanism is that, as you said in the beginning, it has that baggage, and that baggage is originally, of course, the figure is from Christian myth, but through history, all of the negative elements of the Satan character has been reversed or reinterpreted or appropriated in some sense into good things instead, like freedom, for example, or not being with a master. And so, in that sense, Satan actually offers a way of philosophizing over yourself and society in a post-Christian sense. You don't need to have that Christian baggage to understand what Satan is, because he offers all of the values that modern man or woman, for that matter, needs: freedom, sexuality, carnality, and all of that. And in that sense, there are two, as you say, approaches to that figure, that liberating figure. And the one is a more philosophical kind, as LaVey was fond of promoting through his church. And the other was a more esoteric engagement, not necessarily meaning that the esoteric engagement is theistic, that they are devil worshippers, but they use the figure of Satan in a more traditional or explicitly esoteric sense to work rituals, for example, and not just philosophize or oppose or being the adversary, but also practicing it in a more traditional sense. But what is interesting is, as you also point out, that Satanists are using the same material. They are using a lot of things that are out there already, but they are subtly or not so subtly changing the values of these materials. So you can see, for example, LaVey in the Satanic Bible, we were talking a lot about that. He's using a lot of different stories and a lot of different materials to construct his understanding of Satanism. Some of it is more philosophical in the Book of Lucifer. Some of it is more directly vulgar and antagonistic, like in the Book of Satan, where he dismisses Christianity and says a lot of dirty words. And some of it is actually explicitly esoteric and ritualistic, like in the Book of Belial and the Book of Leviathan towards the end. So he's actually using all of these materials to construct this understanding of Satanism. And in the end, the color or the taste of that construction becomes philosophical in a sense. even though he's
and
using
I remember
a lot of different
specifically how much when you boil down, if you talk about that more philosophical Satanism, so this is maybe people who were attracted by the aura of freedom, of hedonism, of self-confidence, and they maybe aren't even that particularly interested in the occult or magic or using, exploring telepathy or, that kind of more occult stuff. They're like, oh, well, I'm interested in this figure. It seems very exciting. And that was clearly a very important part of LaVey's world in the 60s and 70s. And I remember reading, it's always been an interesting thing about LaVey because in some ways, even though he was such a important figure at the time of the counterculture in the 60s and 70s, he didn't like hippies at all. He thought they were silly, and he thought the way that people were taking drugs was kind of stupid. He was more of a kind of martini guy. He was a little bit more of almost like a Playboy magazine kind of guy. Yeah. And so actually, what I realized is that just to say one thing is that in many ways his values were very mainstream.
Yeah. Your story about the Black House is actually a metaphor for Satan, the LaVeyan kind of Satanism, in my opinion, because placing this Black House in a sedate neighborhood, as you said, is exactly what LaVey is describing as the technology or the strategy of Satanism. He talks about 1 part outrage to 9 parts gentleman. So, I mean, he was, as you say, law and order. He disliked hippies and he disliked drugs. He disliked the lack of control. And he had that house, which was an intensely countercultural site in a sense, but in a neighborhood that was kind of sedate. And that's, I think, exactly what LaVey was trying to aim for with this Satanism construction. It is in the name as well, the Church of Satan. That's a combination of something rather mainstream, a church, and something rather marginal, Satan.
And so how I mean, we need to talk about the other side of the coin, the kind of more esoteric view. But before that, I would say, how strong is that more rationalist, more libertarian side of Satanism that's represented by LaVey? How strong is that today? Has that become more of a minor current, or is that still thriving in your opinion within the small subculture?
Even though it's a small subculture, in my opinion, the rationalist Satanists, and that I coined that term in order not to call it LaVeyan, because it has expanded beyond LaVey and his Church of Satan. But by far, the Church of Satan is still the largest organized satanic group, and they are actually becoming more visible in the past 5 or 10 years. They're doing more rituals, they're doing more outreach work, in a sense, through the internet and stuff like that. Even though they're not a religion who is trying to get members, they're still trying to get their presence known on the internet, because for a time they almost lost that they lost their stake on the internet, because other groups were much faster and quicker to actually enter that discourse on the internet. But by far, sociologically speaking, the Church of Satan is the largest, and rationalist Satanism, through the books of LaVey and through some other books that are basically saying the same thing, and groups like the Satanic Temple, a quite recent group who's doing a lot of rationalist stuff. They are quite powerful in a sense. They're making their presence felt.
Well, let me ask you this, and I know you've studied modern Satanism an awful lot, and have you found, or has there been any studies done of kind of types of people that modern Satanism, is there any subgenres, or is it just like any other religion where it's just people from all kinds of places? Or have you found there's a particular disposition that could lead you in that direction?
Actually, an American professor here in Norway, he moved to Norway, James R. Lewis, who is pretty well known within religious studies. He's done a lot of demographic work on Satanism, and he continues to do so through his surveys. And he has discovered or confirmed that there is a lot of breadth, a lot of different types of people attracted. But of course, a large segment of Satanists are younger white males, and they often start out being younger white males, but they become middle-aged white males in time. So that's actually a large demographic group that is, of course, represented, and the Church of Satan is active in promoting women in leading positions, but it is there is a tendency for it to be male-dominated, and of course dominated by Westerners because of the satanic background, and usually they are recruiting from the fairly young. But as you say, the casual Satanists, as you called them, the ones who are drinking in the woods and listening to metal, they're not very good recruits. So the Church of Satan is actually kind of wary with that segment, because they can, with them, it can go either way. They can do it as they did in Norway, set churches on fire and kill each other, or they can actually just become productive members of society, or they can become reflected, mature Satanists, and that's a bit of a gamble.
Well, since you brought up a church burning, without necessarily going in and talking about the whole story of black metal in Norway, etc., I am curious whether you would say, even anecdotally, whether there is a certain kind of Scandinavian or Nordic bent, if there's a certain a particular attraction or a particular role that Satanism and related left-hand stuff plays in the Scandinavian mind, or maybe partly because of the nature of the welfare state. It's as I'm sure you know, it's very funny for people not living in somewhere like Norway, which kind of looks like about the best you can do as a country at this stage in global history. Like, it's a pretty cool place. And then you look at this subculture, particularly in the 90s, but, still continuing. You're like, wow, I mean, how do you wind up being so, full of antinomian spirit when you're so close to, like, paradise? And I know it's not a paradise, but it's still a very interesting tension, particularly for those of us on the outside. And I'm sure I know that you've written about Nordic Satanism in particular. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the particular role that it's played in that country.
Yeah, of course. First of all, I think it's only appropriate to say that black metal as a genre has, of course, a pretty tenuous relationship to Satanism as a religion, and that's one of the things that I really had to delve into in my dissertation in order to see what should be kept apart and what should be related to each other. And of course, some of these youngsters developed, as I said, into mature guys who were interested in Satanism on a different level. But at that time, in the 90s, I think it's important to understand that as you said, the welfare state, even though it has a paradise quality, it also, as William Burroughs says, it produced kind of a robotic society. The conformity and the consensus culture of Scandinavia can be a bit stifling, and I think that in order to understand the black metal Satanism of the 90s, you have to understand rebellion, both as a youth phenomenon, of course, but also as a reaction to a consensus culture being brought up.
And this is really fascinating, because this has got a little microcosm and a hologram involved here, because there seems to be a central theme in Satanism in particular of rebellion. And as you stated, a lot of the demographics seem to be these younger white males who, of course, are like teenagers and they're just rebelling against everything. And that kind of theme with the black metal seems to be about rebellion. So what do you think is like that satanic dissension? And even like, right, Lucifer himself is a dissenter or rebel, so he has that entirely enveloped. Do you think there is some sort of like revolutionary or rebellious power to that, like, satanic movement? Is it ever like for anything, or is it just kind of like to rebel? Period.
That's a big question, but I think luckily I've been studying it long enough to answer it sort of briefly, because the rebelliousness is actually one of the many modes that Satanists use in order to construct Satanism. I was talking about freedom before. That's a more of a positive value for rebellion, and of course crime or destructive behavior or obscenity is more of negatively charged values of that same concept. And in that sense, you can see that of course, these different types of Satanism share a rebellious spirit, because that is in the name. Satan means adversary. But at the same time, you can use the word or interpret the word Satan in different sense and charge it with different values. And that's what when I studied it, I discovered that one of the most powerful tools for what you could call the religious Satanists was to sanitize the concept of Satan. That is, remove those associations that were destructive to building a satanic milieu or a satanic movement, while of course retaining the rebellious nature in a sense. So you removed crime, you removed obscenity, you removed physical violence from that area you defined as satanic in order to keep a certain rebellious spirit, but at the same time live within normal society. And that's where it becomes interesting, because in order to understand Satanism, you have to understand the concept of transgression. And I looked at a lot of different philosophers and sociologists and what they did on transgression. And what is interesting is that nobody has talked about transgression except as something from the inside. You have to transgress some boundary in order to transgress. There has to be a boundary, otherwise you cannot transgress. But what I discovered with Satanists and other religious groups is that, of course, if you have another system, then transgression does not become... transgressing a boundary does not become the goal in itself, but only the means to achieve another structure, another order. So that's actually what defines those two types of Satanism. The black metal Satanists, their goal is to transgress some sort of limit. They are still living within a certain structure or a certain system. Whereas the more mature religious Satanists, they have defined another structure that they are transgressing to. They are not interested in the transgression in itself. They're interested in moving to another system. And that's, of course, not only a satanic thing. You can see that in Thelemic groups as well, or neo-pagan groups, and a lot of places where transgression has a certain value.
I want to just emphasize that, because you put that very well. It was very clearly thought through, is that for certain groups, currents, especially in the sort of esoteric occult side of things, transgression is not an end in itself, but it's a passageway or an initiatory rite almost, at the far end of which is another set of values. At that point, a lot of those gestures might seem relatively unimportant, or something that's useful for the overall structure, but no longer as important for individuals. And that's something I found too in talking with people, particularly with people who have pursued left-hand path, dark side occultism. How I found that I usually end up talking to the nerds and the writers and that kind of person, and so many people. It's clear that transgression is an important part of their life course, but that at the point at which they're mature and they're thinking about other things, they have other problems, including moral, ethical issues that are not necessarily so different from other things that people would wrestle with on the outside. So it's a very interesting space that you're talking about there. I think that adds a lot of light. But I'm going to have to interrupt. We need to take a break right now. You're listening to Expanding Mind on the Progressive Radio Network with Erik Davis and Maja Daou, and we're talking with Professor Jesper Petersen about modern Satanism. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Expanding Mind on the Progressive Radio Network. I'm Maja Daou, here with Erik Davis, and we are speaking today with Professor Jesper Petersen about Satan. So I thank you so much for your answer before the break. That was probably the best I've heard anyone explain it ever. And I wonder if you, while you were undertaking this scholarly task of presenting this satanic material, if you personally experienced any Satanism as a result. Like, for example, did you have to rebel in order to get this material there? Did you find you were presented with obstacles or any boundaries that you yourself had to accomplish in order to even do this work? Or was everybody yeah, go ahead, write this book, it's cool?
That's actually interesting because I thought I would get a lot more resistance when I proposed this because other people who have been trying to get something going have been met with difficulty. And I think one answer is, of course, that living in Scandinavia, it's a secular society, and I think the opportunities to study stuff at the university is they're rather broad-minded, even though it is a subject that I had to apply to several universities in order to get some grant. Then they were open to the fact that the way I described the project, it was a sociological and anthropological and historical study. They could see the value in it, but at the same time, of course. On a personal level, of course, I had to do some field work because I think that's important even for. And there, of course, it was actually quite easy. They are, as we were talking about before, they were most of them are highly moral people and interesting people in their own right. So it's not easy. It's not difficult to engage with them and talk to them. But of course, during the periods of field work in Denmark, I of course I was challenged, both on an intellectual level, but also on an ethical level, where I stood in terms of this, because it is, for outsiders, it can be difficult to understand that you can study religion without necessarily engaging in it on a personal level in your work.
This is important because I think a lot of people prevent this information getting out because they think there is a threat that, if you gaze upon the thing, then it's going to eat you, right? So I'm very interested in your personal experience because you somehow were able to travel to hell and back, so to speak, right? You made the voyage to Mordor and came out alive. It didn't eat you. So was there did you, when you did feel those ethical things, did it kind of just have the result of making your boundaries more firm, or did you ever feel really threatened?
Well, that's a big question because, of course, that touches upon some questions of methodology and some questions of how to do anthropology and history.
Right.
And of course, in a sense, you choose subjects that perhaps you're not interested in them as a personal choice, but they nonetheless resonate with something in you. That's a common theme in anthropology and sociology and other fields. That, of course, when you choose a subject, you have an interest, and that interest is, of course, subjective. But at the same time, I must as I told you, I read the Satanic Bible when I was 17 as well. I chose religious studies because I had an interest in counterculture and psychedelic culture and esoteric culture. But at the same time, I must admit that all of these tools or approaches that I learned and was trained in at the university, it was most of the time it was easy to separate myself as a person from what was going on. But of course there were times when I was challenged in one way or another, and I had to at that time choose what to do in that particular situation. But I think that's not very different from some anthropologists going to some undiscovered tribe in the Amazon basin and getting challenged by their values. It was a similar experience in some sense, but of course I didn't have to travel that far.
Lucky you.
I'd love to go to the Amazon, actually.
Yeah, well, there certainly are devils everywhere, but I want to make sure that we get to the other half of the equation. You know, we've talked about Anton LaVey and what you call rationalist Satanism, which emphasizes freedom and often has a sort of libertarian or hedonistic side that is sometimes very political, very much part of the modern world in a lot of ways. And then there's another current which is closer to esotericism, the occult, magic, where it more involves potentially supernatural forces, or at the very least a greater emphasis on ritual, on altered states, on the possible existence of other kinds of entities or the powers that can be generated through a group or solo ritual. So how do we talk about that stream? What's one way into that?
I think a good starting point is to look at the Satanic Bible as I did before, and look at LaVey when he defined Satanism in the 60s. He included some aspects of esoteric culture. He actually pointed back into history, both in political history and in esoteric history, and said that guy is a Satanist, that woman is a Satanist, a de facto Satanist, he called them that. And in that sense, he appropriated a huge chunk of esoteric culture. But at the same time, he told everybody in his Bible that these people, they were wrong on so many levels, but they were still useful. In a sense, the rituals was useful as psychodramas to affect yourself, but they had no metaphysical component necessarily. And that's actually when you go to the other side of the equation and look at the esoteric Satanists, that's one of their key disagreements with LaVey. That they're actually saying, no, this is important stuff, and we should not just appropriate some aspects and leave the rest alone. We have to see what value this mystical or more idealist approach has, and see the value of using Satan as a model for self-deification is often a word that's used there. So in a sense, they're using the entire history of esotericism and looking at some important aspects of it in order to understand themselves and situate themselves in a different way that from LaVey. And when you look at the esoteric culture, there's a lot of offerings on tap. For example, one of the things that is getting very popular at the moment and has been popular also in metal circles actually is qliphothic magic. That is the inverse side of the tree of life, the tree of death in a sense, because that has a long history both in the Golden Dawn and with Crowley and with Kenneth Grant especially, and that is an interesting thing to take and appropriate into a new construction of Satanism that is not philosophical or rationalist, but is actually deeply Chthonian, deeply underground, underworld, charged with the sacred feminine and carnality in a different way. Even though it's very idealistic in a sense because it has a mystical approach, it is of course also engaged with physical matter. But that's one side, the esoteric side, and LaVey, on the other hand, he always had that material aspect to it. As you said, he had that the martini guy, the gentleman, and that was his approach. Of course, he also had some philosophical and intellectual, and even perhaps a little bit idealist aspects, but they were always deeply immersed into matter. And I think that's one of the big differences between the rationalist Satanism and the esoteric Satanism, if we have to talk about types like that. Yeah. Then that is the approach to how the world is constituted and what is important in the Satanist's life.
Right. Well, I want to ask more about this chthonic, underground, esoteric Satanism, and we can have there's a long scholars love to draw fine distinctions and argue about what category things go into, and I realize that one of those discussions, an important one, is whether or not there's a difference between Satanism and something, a broader category we might call left-hand occultism, left-hand path, in which there's a sort of turn towards the scary stuff, the dark side, the Qippoth, and you know, I'm not so concerned about where you draw that line exactly. What I'm interested in is some light shed on why this is so appealing now. I mean, we see this across the board, you know, even in witchcraft circles, in places where people are not interested in the history of Satan at all. There's a sense that there's a kind of, in metal as well as you talked about, a kind of return to atavism, towards the chthonic, towards not just the material, but the sort of chaotic forces within the material. And from the outside, you can look at it and go like, well, I could see why that's interesting, but I really don't understand why you want to spend so much time with all this like really terrifying stuff. And do you dislike birds and sunrise and sylphs in the air so much that you have to spend all your time? But I realize that's just a kind of naive perception to a certain degree, it doesn't really acknowledge what it is about these increasingly chthonic forces that are so attractive to so many people.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think that as you said, I think a common denominator on the left and the right-hand path, to use that horribly difficult nomenclature, is that there has been for a long time, actually since the Enlightenment in a sense, a strong sense of or focus on self-realization in Western culture. And I think that is one thing that Satanism and in broader sense the left-hand path currents share with a lot of other groups, the witchcraft movements and the New Age groups and all that. The realizing oneself is an important part of being alive in the Western world today. And I think that explains at least one of the things that is interesting about these darker matters is that they are, if you're not satisfied with what, for example, psychedelic culture is offering you or the New Age groups are offering you, then perhaps that is a way that is resonating with your self and your understanding of how to realize yourself. And of course, in many of these left-hand path groups, the self-deification, as I was talking about before, that is actually becoming a god in a sense, transcending the cosmos in order to witness the chaos behind it, is actually perhaps the best way of describing it. Not unifying with the universe or unifying with God, but actually being separate and being a God strong in yourself is what is resonating with a particular person. And I think that we are living, unfortunately, in one sense, and fortunately in another sense, we're living in a spiritual marketplace. That's one of the gifts of the 20th century. So you have that opportunity to select and combine and reinterpret, and in that sense, the left-hand path is an important aspect of finding your own unique voice. And if I have to, one more aspect is, of course, the connection with creativity and artistic expression. And of course, dark matters have always been important in art and literature. And I think that's perhaps what we see, that a return to those aspects in order to understand them on a different level and use them as self-realizing components.
Well, so let me ask you this in your opinion, because this is now building to something bigger. So if we have this inversion of the tree in life, which I guess you could also compare to the inverted cross and all that kind of stuff. If there is this dark material, this dark feminine, which is that like kind of feminine, like Kali type of energy that you're talking about. So why would you say that the majority of Satanists are male and women tend to go to the witchcraft direction? Like, what do you think, even though there does, I mean, I agree, there seem to be so many components in Satanism of accepting this, like the dark matter, the dark mother, and they have those philosophies behind them, and yet women don't seem to like it so much. Like for chicks, they'll be like, I'll go witch. I'm not going to the Church of Satan. Like, do you, in your, like, professional opinion, what do you think it is that sends females away from that kind of particular ideology? Is it just like the dudes, the people involved, or is it, you know, like why aren't more ladies, why do they go the pagan direction instead of Satan?
I have to be careful not to misrepresent Satanism either, because when I was talking about the young white males before, I was talking about statistical studies of the satanic milieu as a whole, and rationalist Satanism in particular is appealing there. But we see, even though it's still perhaps more male dominated, there is a certain recruitment that is more successful within the esoteric Satanist circles with women, and I think that is because they are, as you say, they are elaborating on the sacred feminine and the dark feminine forces, and they have a value. But at the same time, of course, I think one answer, and perhaps that it's not the best answer, but it's the one I have to focus on right now, is that we're still conditioned in a sense from the societies that we grew up in, and in a sense, the choices we make in terms of religion, sometimes they are opposed to what we are brought up with, but oftentimes we carry with us some gender roles and some understandings, and so religions like Thelema, Crowley's OTO and stuff like that is more male-dominated, and Satanism is more male-dominated because of the language and because of how it is constructed, and witchcraft, and in a broader sense, is more appealing to females. But at the same time, I think it's an immensely complicated question, and I think it's hard to find one factor that determines it. But I have to say that in recent times, I have noticed a strong increase in vocal female Satanists. They are, and actually a Swedish, the other editor of the Devil's Party, Per Faxnell, he just finished his dissertation on the Satanic feminine and the Satanic feminism, and he had a lot of field work with the female Satanists, especially in Scandinavia and the U.S., and he talked to a lot of people that actually produced some new and original angles to Satanism as a broad phenomenon, especially by importing, as we're talking about, more general left-hand path aspects to it. Right. So there is a certain development that is difficult to capture with survey sociology and stuff like that, because it usually misses the mark of complexity in order to put things in neat little boxes. Yeah. And I think there is a development going on that's interesting in terms of gender.
We only have a few minutes left, and I feel compelled to ask you about the talk you gave at this year's Here to Go symposium, which is a fascinating sounding symposium on art and esotericism in Norway. And you gave a talk on a satanic prank from 1973. And though this sounds very obscure, I'm absolutely obsessed with 1973 as well as guerrilla ontology. And so I would just love to, as I said, we only have a few minutes. In a way, it's a mean thing to do. But if you could just give us a bit of the story of what this Operation Mindfuck was.
Yeah, but this is actually me stepping out of the safe boundary of Satanism studies and going back to some of the things that I was interested in when I was young. In Denmark in '73, there was a brief, very visible media scare, because on a small island in Denmark, some local residents found a lot of objects that they interpreted as satanic. So for a brief period of time in '73 and '74, Denmark was buzzing with satanic panic, and Satanists were stepping out and saying, we didn't do it, but we understand it, and blah, blah, blah. And what is interesting about that story is that now, 40 years later, we discover that it was a regular guy, a guy working as a museum security guard, who actually throughout his life printed these coins he placed all over Denmark with Satan on it. He placed all these objects on that small island, and he did a lot of other things, sent letters with diabolical intentions to a lot of people. And what is interesting is that he did it with in a sense with a satanic intent to rattle people and shake the establishment. But you cannot call him a Satanist in any way. And that was a very interesting story, because he was actually practicing a lot of things that I'm interested in now, for example, as you say, guerrilla ontology and the whole prank movement, because it has a certain relation to Satanism. The prank is, of course, both benign and somewhat malevolent in a sense, and it shakes things up. So he, in a sense, was both. He was not a Satanist in any sense, intellectually or as a belief, but he did something that was very interesting and in a sense very satanic. So it's one of the most impressive pranks undertaken in any period of time, in my opinion, and it was done in Little Denmark in order to shake up complacency and consensus culture.
Well, that is a wonderful story, and it's also really nice to know that such pranks were going on elsewhere. So we're going to have to wrap it up. Jesper, thanks so much for joining us. This was a fascinating conversation.
My pleasure.
All right, from me and Majid, all you out there, keep your minds open.